Three, two. I have the pleasure to be speaking to Nigel MacLennan today. Nigel's the President-elect of the British Psychological Society. He's a leader in performance psychology relating to coaching, leadership, and organizational performance. Nigel, how are you keeping?
I'm very well, and I have a pleasure to introduce Sean O'Connell, who's a psychologist, a former professional rugby player, and works with sports, business, and educational professionals to improve performance.
So Nigel, it's World Mental Health Day, and I think it's fitting that it sort of falls on this period where we've been through this long sustained COVID lockdown earlier in the year, and it looks like we're on the cusp of coming back to it. And I'm just interested in general, what are your thoughts on the sort of uncertainty, the challenges we faced during COVID, and how that's related to people's mental health?
Uncertainty dramatically affects people's mental health if they don't have the cognitive skills to deal with uncertainty. Some people thrive in uncertainty, and others are absolutely crushed by it. And it seems to be determined by the mental skills that an individual has developed through practice and over time, and perhaps through role modeling through others. So for some people, the lockdown has been absolutely fantastic, and for some people, it's been absolutely disastrous.
Yeah, I think it's very true. And I think you made a very clear distinction there. It's the mental skills. And I think what's key are these skills can be developed, they can be learned, they can be implemented. And I suppose a question is more generally, how available do you think these techniques are? How proficient do you think as a society we are at optimizing our mental health, but also our performance?
Great questions. We're not particularly mental health literate yet. For the vast majority of people, they are able to manage their own mental health very, very successfully. Most people go through their entire lives and they never have to seek professional help for mental health issues, ever. And then there's another category, the next layer up, and those who have minor problems, but they're resolved with the assistance of friends and relatives and so on. But for the next category up, there are some individuals who they're going to need some kind of intervention externally, outside of their friendship group, outside of their relative group, either on a paid or an unpaid basis. And then at the next level up, there are those who are going to require full-on psychiatric intervention. And then at the unfortunate end of the scale, you've got individuals whose mental health can only be recovered if they go through a period of hospitalization or being sectioned. So I think as a society, we're not particularly well informed, and I don't think we encourage people enough to take responsibility for developing their own mental health.
I think it's interesting. I think there's certainly a stigma around mental health. It's something which, as you've alluded to, it's something which perhaps people aren't forthcoming with. It's something that people wouldn't want to necessarily admit. And I think we've certainly taken initial steps in recognizing that actually mental health isn't something to be sort of defensive about or shied away from, but actually it's something we should move towards. So, I often use the analogy, if you had a car which wasn't working particularly well, you'd bring it to the garage, or you'd sort of try to diagnose it and see how you can improve it. And I think one particular misconception around mental health is it's similar to any other form of health. If you have a broken arm, you would go get an x-ray and you would get a cast put on it. And the brain is no different. We have these mechanisms which are designed to function in a certain way. And for whatever reason, whether that's a stressful acute period time in the life, those mechanisms start to go out of sync. And at that point, we start to see attitude shifts, cognitive shifts, behavioral shifts. And really the opportunity to set those back in line isn't something we should see as a defeat or something that's personally wrong with us, but actually an opportunity for us to do better, which is something people should be excited about.
I agree. In professional rugby, where stress and uncertainty are constant, and of course there's the pervasive risk of serious injury, how do professional rugby players cope with the mental health challenges that they must be more under than the rest of us?
Well, I think what was interesting is within any professional sport, this period has shown that actually, if you disrupt someone's usual rhythm, their usual routines, they start to fall into those habits of maybe poor mental health. Typically, our stress responses in particular, they're governed by our autonomic nervous system, which with highly trained athletes tends to be pretty well regulated. But we all suffer from acute stress at periods, and I think learning techniques on how to push back on that is really important, not only for performance on the field, which we know if you look at someone who's, in whether it's a sort of last minute shot to win a game or something of that matter, the ability to deliver in those key moments is so important, that actually having those strategies that you can implement immediately to push back on that stress and just to get the right level of arousal, both physically and mentally, in order to deliver within those key moments. But I think more telling is that instance where as soon as that rugby player, that professional athlete is taken out of the environment, as we've seen with COVID, all of a sudden their goals in particular, they sort of, I think that's one of the biggest challenges faced more generally through uncertainty, is that people's ability to behave in a certain way to achieve their goals has been disrupted. And it's that challenge which has probably been most disrupted to people's mental health.
Are you suggesting that in a professional sports environment, the players, the participants are very supportive of each other facing the psychological challenges of the pressure?
I think there's a range. I think within any team, you have different social dynamics, and those dynamics either facilitate high performance. Sometimes, unfortunately, they can hinder it. I think one challenge, particularly within male sports, is there's this sort of masculine attitude where you don't want to accept any sense of weakness or any perceived weakness. And I actually think that's one of the biggest barriers which is being crossed. And I know there's a fantastic charity, Noggin, which do a lot of work around mental health. But I think within sport and more generally within society, this idea of uncertainty leading to anxiety due to that inability to perceive or to achieve or pursue goals is one of the biggest barriers. And I'm sure it's something that you've found working with leaders of multinational businesses as well.
Yeah, I found over the years that the people who are mentally healthiest are those who take most active responsibility for their mental health. So for them, mental health is not a passive thing. In fact, let me just do a quick aside. Maybe the label mental health might be a problem. Maybe if we had a more constructive label, mental well-being, we would feel a little bit more inclined to engage in it. We engage in physical well-being, physical health. Physical health doesn't sound quite as right as physical well-being, does it? Maybe we need to change that label so that people think it's a sensible thing to engage in mental well-being. Whereas the label mental health improves that there are such things as mental illnesses.
Mm.
And if there are mental illnesses, then they're certainly few and far between. There are very, very few things external to the human body that are responsible for mental ill health. There are a few things, hepatic disorders, liver disorders, and there are a few other biochemical causes of mental ill health. But they're so few and far between that to be minuscule in the scheme of things. So I'm suggesting that that we moved away from mental health as a label towards mental well-being as a label, so that we can encourage people to take charge of their own well-being. What do you think?
I think you make a good point about sort of changing the narrative around it, and to touch on well-being as well. It's sort of a term which you see becoming increasingly prevalent within society, but you'd question, has it become a diluted term? Do people really know what well-being is? And do they understand how they can optimize it in order to achieve the outcomes that they want to?
That's a very good call. Maybe there's a little period of education that's required to get people on board with the concept of mental well-being as opposed to mental health. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think there's an interesting concept as well, which it's one which I reflect on, is that I think through evolution, we've almost been designed now to perform optimally when we're in our natural environment. And I think some of the issues around mental health are probably our own doing. You think, previously we sleep in terms of with the light, our circadian rhythm would be naturally regulated through our external environment. Things like diet, we wouldn't have access to, highly refined sugars, or if we did, it'd be fairly rare. We'd go through periods of fasting, and we're almost seeing now a shift back towards some of those more, I guess, primitive lifestyles in an attempt to almost try and recapture some of those performance benefits. You see professional athletes nowadays adopting various different feeding times. I mentioned the intermittent fasting as one of them, but we know it has a knock-on effects on things like our gut bacteria. It has a knock-on effect on our immune system. So all of a sudden we're starting to see these changes which sort of form a mechanism or a system of mechanisms which then start to optimize mental health. And I wonder, from what you've observed, do you think as a society we're almost overly stimulated in certain areas, or we've created a lifestyle for ourselves which actually isn't supporting optimal performance?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Sean. The number of people that I deal with and have dealt with over the years, where they're having fluctuations in mood that they believe are mental well-being based, but in fact they're physiological based. So for instance, people who are taking large amounts of sugar have sugar highs and sugar lows. And we all know what a sugar low feels like. It's not particularly pleasant. And we all know what a sugar high feels like. It's too pleasant, but it's very, very fleeting. And I think the variation that those extremes in sugar consumption cause can perhaps give people a sense that their mental well-being is all over the place. It gives them an unstable platform on which to base their mental well-being. And then there's the other factor as well, which is extremely common, and that is caffeine overdose. When people take too much caffeine, their brain becomes very difficult to control. It becomes very difficult to focus thinking. And at the other end of the scale, when people are having caffeine withdrawal, it's a very unpleasant experience too. And again, that destabilizes mental well-being. And if an individual is not aware of the fluctuations in their mental well-being caused by sugar highs and sugar lows and caffeine highs and caffeine lows, they're probably going to think they're emotionally and psychologically all over the place, which is going to give them the sense that their mental well-being is not good. So I think there's, what you're saying is right. Our modern day diets, I think, can lead us to think our mental well-being is very, very badly off kilter, and it is biochemically off kilter. But if we take away that artificially stimulated imbalance that would create, I think a very large number of people would feel themselves to be enormously more mentally healthy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think to add and take that a step further, I think there's also another issue, which is this prioritization of sort of immediate gratification over long-term benefits. And I think what's most troubling is we're starting to see that trickle down into children, at younger and younger ages. And of course, we know that children's prefrontal cortex isn't as well developed. Their ability to regulate impulsive behaviors isn't as strong. And I think of the classic marshmallow experiment, whereby if you wait 15 minutes, you get a second marshmallow. Children of the age of 4 aren't good at that. And you can see the older children, or, as you go into sort of adolescence and adulthood, they improve their ability to regulate their behavior. But now we're seeing an increase in the, I suppose, number of addictive vices, essentially, to think of things like, you've mentioned coffee, which, it scares me, but you see more and more young people drinking coffee now. But, iPhones are incredibly addictive, and we know that they've severe impacts on the brain, not only in terms of our dopamine, our reward pathways, but also socially, where we're starting to see issues through social media, through social comparison, and also not only the use of the social media, but how it sort of then knocks on into other important, regulatory mechanisms. So, for example, if you're on your phone till 10 o'clock at night, it's going to impact your sleep. You're not going to be able to get the sort of quality of sleep you need through, the light suppressing your melatonin release. And all of a sudden you start to wonder why mental health is on the decline. And I think what's most concerning is to observe the young age that it's starting to take place at. I mean, recently we saw with exams, students getting extremely stressed about it, and you just seen increasingly the burdens of mental health are being placed on a younger age group within society, perhaps because they're being given these vices which they're not actually mature enough mentally to regulate or self-regulate.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. Something that always has struck me as really, really strange is that we don't teach mental well-being in schools. we don't teach, or indeed at universities for that matter, we don't teach young people how to look after their own mental well-being, what cognitive processes create strong mental health, what emotional processes create strong mental health, what behavioral processes create strong mental health, and so on and so on. It's not surprising to me that with all the changes that are going on in society, and we are living through probably the fastest changing society that humans have ever lived through, it's not surprising given the speed of change that mental health seems to be widely deteriorating when we're not teaching our young people how to look after their own mental health. And I'm not pitching for psychologists to have more work here. I'm pitching for the need for psychologists to be reduced. If we teach young people mental well-being skills, then the chances are they're going to be able to look after their own mental health, and fewer psychologists will be needed.
I think there's an element of responsibility as well with the messages that young people or anyone in general are receiving. And I've seen, I suppose, as part of this stigma around mental health, it's the okay not to be okay, that there's some sort of advice or some narratives that have been attached with it, which I don't think are necessarily best serving. And some of those are ideas of self-compassion brought to an extreme, which are inappropriate. And we know that self-compassion is hugely important. We know that gratitude is vital in terms of not only restoring our serotonin systems, but more importantly in terms of bringing us into the moment. But there's gratitude, and then there's a sort of misconception that actually you're rewarding yourself for doing nothing, or you're actually not being demanding of yourself to achieve goals, which we know humans are designed to be goal pursuing. And that's actually one of the key elements which brings us happiness and fulfillment, is engagement in meaningful goals.
Absolutely. Without purpose, people perish, generally speaking. And the clearer and more focused that purpose is, the happier people seem to be. It's almost as though happiness is a side effect of being focused on something that has great meaning to the individual. Of course, happiness can be created at any time. We can make ourselves feel any way we want, any time we want, with a bit of practice. It's not something you can do without having learned how to do it. But with a bit of practice, you really can control your emotions at any point in your life, under any circumstances, even the most adverse circumstances. But that's the kind of thing that I think we ought to be teaching when we're teaching young people how to look after their own mental well-being. And it's probably not just young people that need to be taught that as well. I think probably we need to be teaching the entire population how to look after their own mental well-being, how to create their own mental well-being, how to maintain their own mental well-being, and maybe even go the next step and give them the information that they can share with others, so that others can look after their own mental well-being better than previously as well.
Yeah, I think you've made some good points there. I think firstly, we know that when we're in a positive state of mind, we're more productive, we're more creative, we're higher motivation levels, we're more resilient. So we've all these key elements where actually, if we're able to manage our own internal sort of emotional state, we're much better able to perform. You imagine if you teach someone at the age of 6 those skills, imagine what their life trajectory looks like to someone who only learns that when they're 26. It's a completely different comparison. And I think as a society, we should be striving for excellence. We should be encouraging people to fulfill their potential and not to be shackled through a lack of knowledge. And I think given that knowledge is so prevalent nowadays, it is something we should be trying to bridge that gap in terms of making that knowledge readily available and easily applicable. There's you sort of mentioned an interesting side of it as well, and it seemed there was a sort of amalgamation of a few issues which people perhaps nowadays almost feeling like they can't have the success nowadays, and it sort of links back to some of the social media stuff whereby you see others who are already successful and you think, oh, well, why aren't I successful? And we know when we make comparisons, they're not always, we're comparing apples and oranges lots of times, but it seems like there's these combination of things where we're making comparisons. We're probably not in the mental state to be able to regulate the negative impact of those comparisons. And secondly, we're almost looking for this instant gratification as well, whereby you're comparing yourself to someone who's had 20, 30 years more experience or is further along in their career. And then all of a sudden, it's almost like our resilience or our determination is just instantly wiped out by unrealistic expectations. And I know you do a lot of work with leaders and coaching, and goal setting is a key theme of that.
Yeah, self gratification. That's a big theme, and self comparison, big theme as well in terms of mental well-being. Comparing oneself to others is always a route to unhappiness. It doesn't work out very favorably for any of us, because there's always somebody who's better, there's always somebody who's more experienced, there's always somebody who's more articulate, there's always somebody, choose any variable you wish, and there's always somebody who's got something we don't have. So yes, comparing oneself to others is a recipe. Many religions talk about that. One in particular, Buddhism, it talks about how unwise it is to engage in comparing oneself to others. If we make people aware when we're trying to help them develop their own mental health, that comparing oneself to others is counterproductive, and that focusing one's efforts on making oneself as good as one can be in the time frame that one's got available, then it's generally better for people's mental well-being. Unfortunately, we don't teach this, and it doesn't look as though we're planning to teach this anytime in the near future either, which is rather sad, I think.
I think particularly as through the changes and the economic climate that has been created through COVID, we're likely to see a lot of redundancies if we haven't seen them already. There's huge financial insecurity, and we know that often our job roles or status or financial income, they can be really important reflections of our identity. And we know that identity is a very important aspect of mental health. So I suppose what advice or what tools could you give someone who could potentially be facing redundancy?
Well, life is full of change. All of us face change all the time. Some of those changes are more dramatic than others. My recommendation to anyone who's facing something like redundancy or a massive life change because of COVID is to look inside themselves for the resources, the resilience that they have. Most of us have experienced big dramatic changes in our lives before, and if we look to how we managed those successfully before and learn from those previous adversities and bring them forward into the present, most of us are better equipped to handle adversities than we actually think. If we choose to see something like redundancy as a bad move, a horrible thing to happen to us, then it's much more difficult to cope with than if we see it as, okay, I'd rather not have chosen this, but now that it has happened, how can I turn it into something fantastic? There's no end of successful case histories where an individual has been made redundant or fired or lost their job for unpleasant reasons, and they've gone on to either find their dream job or change career entirely, or in many cases, set up their own businesses and become spectacularly successful as entrepreneurs. And so it's a matter of the perception. If we believe redundancy is a setback, it's a life damaging event, then we'll probably behave in a way that fulfills that belief. If we believe it's an opportunity, we'll probably behave in a way that fulfills that belief.
And I really like that idea, because I think it's so true. I think there's so many of our life events, they are what we make of them. And we know through a healthy, psychological immune system, often we look back in points in our life and we go, oh, that bad thing happened in order to get me to this stage. And we know, of course, that there's no correlation or anything like that. It's meaning that we attribute to it. But I think the key element of it is having that belief and faith in your own abilities and internal resources in order to create something out of a negative situation. And I think the tendency is often to sort of be concerned. I know we obviously react very strongly to a sense of loss, but actually I think your advice of seeing the potential gains and focusing your attention and efforts on that gives a much more adaptive route forward through any challenges, which actually we know encourages further positive change.
Absolutely. But the work I've been doing over the years, something keeps cropping up, and this is supported in the literature as well. Um, when you find successful people, you find usually individuals who've become better and better and better at solving problems. How have they become better and better and better at solving problems? It's because they've faced more problems than everybody else. They've had more adversities, they've had more setbacks. And because they've had more adversities and more setbacks, they've had more training in how to handle adversity and setbacks. And because they've become better at handling adversities and setbacks, whatever life throws at them, by and large, they've figured out how to cope with it. And they seem to get to a point where they want bigger and bigger problems because they know that each time they solve another bigger problem, it equips them to go on in the future to solve even bigger problems. So most people run away from adversity and problems, whereas those individuals who choose to embrace them and learn from them, they've actually put themselves on the trajectory to success.
Mm. And I think one of the challenges is that people sometimes forget that actually, as you mentioned earlier, they have done it already. There's a quote I love, which is it's relating to sport as a tool or a vehicle to learn how to be successful. And I think it suits was the quote, and it is it's the voluntary acceptance of challenge which creates positive change. It's those, as you mentioned there, it's us deciding that we want to challenge ourselves that actually allows us to develop those skills, which when we're inevitably faced with consequences or challenges or problems that we can't control, we know that we have the capabilities and capacity to deal with it. And I suppose I wanted to sort of end this interview or this conversation on something where we could discuss about thriving for the future. And I think that could potentially be a really good sort of note to leave it on, which is that idea of if you continue to pursue personal challenges in your own life rather than wait for them to come to you, you often end up sort of ahead of the ball. And I suppose it's almost we can't control the weather, but we can control our reactions to it. And if we can get out and we can go for a run in the rain, or if we can persevere through hard personal periods, we develop those core skills which see us through other hard periods, and we get that sort of adaptation going forward.
Absolutely. If we set ourselves a goal, we're voluntarily taking on a whole chain of challenges, most of which we can't see at the point at which we set the goal. In other words, the challenges that we need to overcome to achieve the goal are invisible to us at the point we set the goal. But that's fine, because as I've said before, people who become successful are people who become very, very good at solving life's problems. And the more successful they become, the better they are at solving life's problems. So if you want to become successful, and maybe we should take some time to define success, because that could be quite a nebulous concept. There was a wonderful definition I came across from Earl Nightingale going back to 1954. And he said, it is the pursuit of a worthy goal. The pursuit of a worthy goal. So he's saying here that success is not defined by you getting to the end point. He's saying success is defined as the process. In other words, once you've set the goal, if you're in the process of achieving that goal, you are successful. Why is he saying that? Well, I think he's saying that because the process is what throws up the challenges, and the more challenges you throw up in the pursuit of your goal, in the process of achieving your goal, the more able you are to develop the ability to solve future challenges. So I think he's right. You don't become successful at the end point. You become successful when you're engaged in the process. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is a case of, I think there's another element of it as well, which is if you're not enjoying that path, it's probably it's a flag that actually you're not on the right path. And I know through these various social pressures, sometimes we feel expectations of how much money we should earn, where we should live, what clothes we should wear. And again, these are all driven or heightened by social media, but actually being able to be honest and truthful with yourself and how you feel. Our feelings are good intuitive indicators as to whether we're following our values or whether playing out our values is working for us and whether we need to readjust those values. So I think there's an element of truth and being true to our own personal values and meaning is a huge element of that, which actually we know allows people to persevere much further than if they were doing if they were following any goals for external reasons. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
And I agree with what you said too, that maybe Earl Nightingale's goal needs a little bit of qualification. You talked about the goal needing to be congruent with our values and our expectations. Maybe we need to put just one more word into his definition: the joyful pursuit of a worthy goal.
Yeah, completely. Nigel, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure this will be very useful for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Take care.
Cheers. Take care.